when Alexander Sterling, Chicago's most ruthless billionaire, comes home unexpectedly and finds his quiet housekeeper dancing with breathtaking grace in his empty mansion. He's forced to face the painful memories he's buried for 5 years. Isabella Martinez has been hiding her past as a trained ballerina, sacrificing her dreams to care for her younger brother after their parents' tragic death. What starts as a moment of shocking discovery turns into a journey of mutual healing, as two broken souls find redemption through an impossible act of faith. When Alexander offers Isabella a chance to reclaim her abandoned dreams, neither realizes that saving someone else might be the only way to save themselves. But when the past and present collide on opening night, will their fragile connection survive the weight of everything they've both lost and found?
Hello. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. At the end, please rate the story. I will be happy to respond to you in the comments. Now, let's get to the story.
The cold wind of Chicago whistled against the immense windows of the 42nd floor, creating a melancholic melody that echoed through the empty corridors of the penthouse. Alexander Sterling stood motionless before the glass wall, watching the city spread below him like a lit chessboard. His gray eyes, once bright with dreams and ambitions, now reflected only the chill of the urban lights. At 6 o'clock sharp, as he had done every day for the past 5 years, Alexander stepped away from the window. His footsteps echoed with military precision on the Italian marble, each movement calculated, every second accounted for. The 3,000-square-foot penthouse that had cost $22 million was a monument to his technological genius, walls clad in Brazilian mahogany, artworks worth fortunes, furniture designed by the most renowned architects in the world. But it was also a silent mausoleum where life had long since ceased. Isabella Martinez was already there, of course. She always arrived at 5:30, an hour and a half before the official time, because she knew that when Alexander Sterling came down for his breakfast at 6:15, everything had to be impeccable. The aroma of premium Colombian coffee already perfumed the air. The curtains were open just right, not too much to dazzle, not too little to darken, and not a speck of dust dared to exist on any surface. She moved like a shadow through the gourmet kitchen, her rubber sneakers making no sound on the heated floor. At 22, Isabella carried on her delicate shoulders the weight of responsibilities that should belong to someone much older. Her brown hair was always tied in a perfect bun, and her dark eyes, though bright with intelligence, remained invariably downcast when Alexander was around. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," she murmured as he entered the kitchen, her voice as soft as a whisper. She did not expect a response. Having worked there for 5 years, she had learned that Alexander Sterling did not waste words on employees. He grunted something that could be interpreted as a greeting, took his cup of the finest Chinese porcelain, and drank the coffee in silence. Isabella took the opportunity to discreetly step away, starting to clean surfaces that were already pristine, just to have something to do until he finished. As Alexander scrolled through emails on his tablet, Isabella allowed herself a moment to observe him. He was an imposing man, even at 45. Black hair with silver strands at the temples, broad shoulders that perfectly filled the tailored suits that cost more than she earned in a year. There was something in his face that suggested he had once been different, softer, perhaps even kind. But now, his features seemed chiseled from granite, as inaccessible as the mountains she only saw in photographs. "Fresh coffee at 2 o'clock, he said without looking up, his voice laden with cold authority. "Meeting with the Japanese at 3. "Yes, sir," Isabella replied, though she knew he had already left the kitchen before she finished her sentence. The rest of the morning passed in the usual routine. Alexander locked himself in the office, a sanctuary of mahogany and leather where multiple screens displayed graphs representing millions of dollars in motion. The sounds emanating from there were always the same: the constant clicking of the keyboard, the brief ringing of the phone, sometimes a raised voice in frustration when a deal did not go as planned. Isabella worked methodically through the other rooms. The library with its thousands of books that were never touched, the formal dining room with a table for 20 that never hosted guests, the 4 guest rooms that remained eternally empty. Each room was a statement of loneliness disguised as opulence. In the middle of the afternoon, while polishing the marble staircase leading to the 2nd floor, Isabella allowed herself to think of Diego. Her younger brother was in his 2nd year at Northwestern University, studying civil engineering with a partial scholarship that she had helped secure. The rest of the tuition, $2,000 a month, came directly from her salary. She earned $3,500 a month, a generous amount for a housekeeper, but after setting aside money for Diego, she was left with only $500 for her own needs. Her phone vibrated silently in her pocket. A message from Diego. "ISI, I passed the calculus exam. A grade. Thank you for making this possible. Love you." A genuine smile lit up Isabella's face for the first time that day. It was worth every sacrifice, every hour of silent work, every moment she felt invisible in this cold mansion. Diego would have the education she could never have, the future she could never dream of. "Isabella." Alexander's sharp voice echoed down the hallway, making her jump. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," she replied, appearing instantly at the top of the staircase. "Coffee. Now." She quickly descended, prepared a new cup of the special blend he preferred, half Colombian, half Brazilian, with a hint of vanilla that she had discovered he liked, though he had never mentioned it. When she entered the office, Alexander had his back to her, speaking on the phone in low, tense tones. "I don't care what the board said, Marcus. 42 million is my final limit for the acquisition of Thompson Tech. If they don't accept, we'll find another target." He gestured impatiently, not noticing that Isabella had placed the coffee on the table and was silently heading for the exit. "And Marcus," Alexander continued, his voice taking on a hardness that made Isabella involuntarily shudder, "if there is one more leak of information to the press, you will be looking for a job tomorrow." Isabella carefully closed the office door, her heart racing. There were moments when Alexander Sterling's coldness frightened her, reminding her that she worked for a man who had built an empire by destroying competitors with the same ease with which she folded sheets. The hours dragged on until the end of the afternoon. Isabella finished her tasks with her usual precision, the bath towels arranged at perfect angles, the furniture without a single fingerprint, the polished floor reflecting the expensive lights. At 5:30, while organizing the final details in the kitchen, she heard the familiar footsteps of Alexander descending the main staircase. He appeared wearing a black suit that probably cost more than the used car she drove. His tie was made of Italian silk, his leather shoes shone like mirrors, and his hair was styled with surgical precision. Even so, there was something in his eyes that suggested fatigue, not physical fatigue, but something deeper, as if his soul were exhausted. "Don't wait up for me," he said, grabbing the keys to the Ferrari he left on the black granite counter. "The meeting with the German investors may run late." Isabella simply nodded, watching him leave. The private elevator closed with a soft whisper, and she heard the distant sound of the car engine fading into the underground garage. And then, like every night, silence descended upon the penthouse like a heavy shroud. Isabella finished putting away the last utensils, checked that all the lights were in night mode, and headed to the small maid's room at the end of the hallway, a 3x3 space that contained only a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that overlooked the building's inner courtyard. Sitting on her bed, Isabella picked up the phone and called Diego. Her tired voice transformed instantly as she heard her brother's enthusiasm talking about his studies, his classmates, his dreams for the future. For 20 minutes, the cold penthouse felt less lonely. When she hung up the phone, Isabella laid down and stared at the ceiling. Sometimes she wondered what tragedy had transformed Alexander Sterling into the Iceman he was today. There were photographs scattered throughout the house, some old, where he appeared smiling next to a blonde woman and a small child. But those photos were few, and Alexander always averted his gaze when passing by them. The wind continued to howl outside, and Isabella pulled the thin blanket over her shoulders. Tomorrow would be another identical day, the same silence, the same coldness, the same relentless routine. But it was also another day closer to Diego's graduation, another step toward the dream she secretly nurtured of one day having her own little house, perhaps even a family. In the depths of the night, the penthouse remained immersed in its oppressive silence, two lonely people separated by worlds of difference, each carrying their own burdens in silence. The wind of Chicago continued its melancholic song, and the city twinkled below, indifferent to the loneliness that reigned above. The sound of Ferrari tires screeching against the wet asphalt echoed through the underground parking lot of Sterling Tower. Alexander slammed the car door harder than necessary, the metallic sound reverberating off the concrete walls like a gunshot. 3 hours. 3 damn hours wasted because of a family emergency from the president of Yamamoto Industries. His footsteps resonated with irritation as he walked toward the private elevator. The meeting had been planned for weeks. $45 million in pending investments, contracts that could open the doors to the Asian market for his newest tech venture. And all cancelled by a last-minute call, Yamamoto's trembling voice apologizing in broken English about his daughter being in the hospital. Alexander pressed the button for the 42nd floor harder than necessary. The elevator ascended silently, but his mind was buzzing with alternative plans, calculations of loss, strategies to save the business. 45 years building empires, and he still had to deal with the human weaknesses of others disrupting his plans. When the elevator doors opened, Alexander was already loosening his tie, eager to lock himself in the office with the 20-year-old whiskey and the financial reports that always managed to calm his restless mind. But something made him stop. Music. He frowned, remaining still in the marble entrance hall. There was music coming from the main room, soft, melancholic notes, floating through the air like ghosts. Alexander checked his watch, 9:15 in the evening. Isabella should already be in her room or, at best, in the kitchen finishing some cleaning task. She certainly shouldn't be in the main room, using his $50,000 sound system as if she owned it. The irritation that was already boiling in his veins from the cancelled meeting found a new target. He quietly placed the keys on the hall table, his movements controlled by the tension building in his muscles. It wasn't just the fact that Isabella was using his things, it was the audacity of being in the main room, the most important space in the house, where he conducted important meetings and where she simply shouldn't be. Alexander completely loosened the knot of his tie, letting it hang over his chest as he unbuttoned the first button of his shirt. The fabric was sticking to his skin from the sweat of irritation, and he ran a hand through his hair, undoing the perfect hairstyle. His Italian leather shoes made a dry sound against the marble as he moved toward the music. The notes became clearer with each step. It wasn't just any music, it was classical, something he vaguely recognized but couldn't identify. Violins and cellos intertwined in a melancholic dance that seemed to echo off the walls, creating an atmosphere he couldn't name. Something between nostalgia and sadness, something that stirred parts of his soul he had buried long ago. Alexander stopped at the beginning of the hallway leading to the main room, his hands clenching into fists. The music was definitely coming from there, flowing through the double mahogany doors like water. He could see a soft light emanating from the space, not the main lights, but something more subtle, more intimate. The irritation in his chest now mixed with something akin to curiosity, although he struggled to suppress that feeling. Why the hell was she there? In 2 years of work, Isabella had never given him a reason to complain. She was efficient, discreet, almost invisible. Perhaps that was exactly why this breach of protocol bothered him so much. He had built his life on predictable routines, clear boundaries, on relationships that remained strictly defined. Employees were employees. Bosses were bosses. And both stayed in their designated places. The music grew in intensity, the strings singing a melody that felt familiar, as if it were part of a memory he couldn't reach. Alexander felt a strange pang in his chest, not physical pain, but something deeper, as if the music were unearthing feelings he had carefully buried under layers of business focus and cold ambition. He forced himself to take another step, then another. His movements were calculated, predatory, like an executive preparing to fire an incompetent employee. But why were his hands trembling slightly? Why was his heart beating faster than it should? The main room was his sanctum sanctorum, the place where he had closed billion-dollar deals, where he had planned the destruction of competitors, where he had built strategies that changed entire industries. It was also the place where, on lonely nights, he sometimes allowed himself to remember times he would rather forget. The Italian leather sofa where he once read stories too. Alexander cut the thought off before it could fully form. A few more steps. The music now enveloped his senses completely, the deep notes of the cellos vibrating in his chest like a second heart. There was something hypnotic about the melody, something that pulled him forward even when his rational mind screamed for him to simply call Isabella, reprimand her properly, and send her to her room. But he didn't call. Instead, he continued walking toward the double doors, his steps silent on the Persian rug that had cost more than most people earned in a year. The soft light emanating from the room created dancing shadows in the hallway, and Alexander felt something strange moving in his stomach, not anger, not irritation, but something he couldn't identify. He stopped a few meters from the doors, the music now so clear he could distinguish each individual instrument. It was a complex, sophisticated piece, not the kind of music he would expect a young housekeeper to know or appreciate. This left him even more unsettled. Alexander took a deep breath, preparing to enter and confront Isabella. His words were already forming in his mind, cold, cutting, designed to establish clear boundaries and ensure that such an invasion never occurred again. He was Alexander Sterling, builder of empires, destroyer of competitors, a man who did not tolerate disrespect or insubordination. With one last breath, he approached the double doors, extending his hand to push them open. The music seemed to swell in anticipation, the strings intertwining in an emotional crescendo that made his heart beat against his ribs. He didn't know why he was hesitating, why his hand remained still on the polished wood. What the hell was happening to him? Alexander shook his head, forcing himself back into executive mode. He pushed the ajar door a few more inches, the music now flowing freely around him like a current. The soft light spilled over his face, and he prepared to enter, to put an end to that inappropriate invasion of his property. Alexander carefully pushed the door, preparing for the confrontation he had mentally rehearsed. His mouth was already opening to utter the cutting words that would set the appropriate boundaries when the movement in the center of the room made him freeze completely. Isabella was dancing. It was not a casual or unpretentious dance, it was something transcendental, something that completely transformed the shy young woman he knew into an ethereal and magnetic creature. She moved with a grace that seemed to defy gravity, her arms flowing like water through the air, her bare feet touching the Italian marble floor with the lightness of falling petals. Alexander felt his breath catch in his throat. The music now, he recognized it. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, enveloped Isabella like an invisible veil, and she responded to each note with movements that seemed to have been written by the music itself. Her hands arched into positions that Alexander instinctively knew were technically perfect, even without knowing ballet. There were years of training in each gesture, a precision that only came from absolute discipline and dedication. She had let her hair down, which now fell in brown waves over her shoulders, swaying gently as she moved. The maid's uniform had been replaced by a simple white t-shirt and black leggings, clothes that revealed the natural grace of her movements. There was no makeup, no adornments, just the purity of her talent and the passion radiating from every fiber of her being. Alexander remained motionless at the entrance, forgotten of his irritation, forgotten of his intentions to reprimand her. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, now followed her every movement with an intensity he could not explain. When Isabella executed a series of pirouettes that brought her close to the panoramic windows, the soft city light created a golden halo around her silhouette, and Alexander felt something stir in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced in so long that he had almost forgotten it. Chopin's Nocturne flowed through the most melancholic notes, and Isabella responded with movements that seemed to tell a wordless story. Her hands reached out in supplication, then closed against her chest as if embracing a deep pain. Alexander watched, fascinated, as she curved into a perfect arabesque, one leg extended back while her torso leaned forward, creating a line that was pure poetry in motion. How had she learned to dance like this? Where would a young maid who sent all her salary to her brother have found the time or money for such training? Questions formed in his mind, but they were quickly dissipated by the hypnosis of her movements. Each gesture was laden with an emotion that Alexander recognized but could not name, something between longing and hope, between loss and search. Isabella executed a sequence of grand jetés that carried her across the room, her feet touching the ground for only moments before launching back into the air. Alexander could see defined muscles in her legs, evidence of years of rigorous training. When she landed in fifth position, her arms moved in port de bras that demonstrated not only technique but true artistic understanding of the music. The music grew in emotional intensity, and Isabella seemed to absorb it through every pore. Her eyes were closed, her face transfigured by an expression of deep peace that Alexander had never seen before. This was not the shy Isabella who murmured yes, sir, and kept her eyes down. This was a completely different woman, confident, powerful, radiating a passion that seemed to burn from the inside out. Alexander found himself holding his breath as she executed a develop that raised her leg in a perfect extension beside her body, maintaining balance with an ease that spoke of years of practice. How had she kept this talent hidden? How had he worked alongside her for 2 years without ever suspecting that a magnificent artist lived in his own home? Alexander's heart began to race not from the irritation he had felt moments before, but from something much more dangerous. There was a beauty in Isabella's movements that touched parts of his soul he had carefully numbed. It was as if she were dancing directly over the walls he had built around his heart, cracking them with each graceful gesture. Isabella moved toward the $1 million grand piano that adorned a corner of the room, her movements becoming more intimate, more personal. She placed one hand on the instrument, and bowed into a position that made her body form a perfect line of devotion. Alexander could see silent tears streaming down her face, even as she continued to smile, an expression of joy mixed with sadness that he recognized from somewhere deep in his memory. The music of Chopin reached an emotional crescendo, and Isabella responded with a series of movements that seemed to liberate her soul. She extended into a grand écart, then rose into an attitude that demonstrated not only flexibility but true artistic passion. Alexander felt a pang in his chest, something akin to the pain he had felt when everything had crumbled in his personal life years ago. Isabella spun in a series of shens that brought her back to the center of the room, her hair flying around her face like a liquid crown. Alexander could see the sweat glistening on her forehead, evidence of the physical effort she was investing in the dance. But there was also something more, a radiance that seemed to come from within, as if dancing was not just what she did, but who she was. The nocturne began to move toward its final chords, and Isabella seemed to sense the approach of the end. Her movements became more expansive, more desperate, as if she were trying to capture every remaining note and transform it into movement. Alexander watched, completely absorbed, as she executed a final sequence that ended with her bowing in a deep reverence, her arms extending as if offering her heart to the music. For a moment, there was complete silence. Isabella remained bowed, her breath heavy but controlled, her face still transfigured by the experience of having fully connected with the music. Alexander felt as if he had witnessed something sacred, something that was not meant to be seen by others. And then, slowly, Isabella began to straighten up. Perhaps it was an instinct, or perhaps some involuntary sound he had made, but she suddenly turned toward the double doors. Her eyes, still bright with the tears of the dance, met his across the distance that separated them. Time stopped. Alexander remained motionless at the entrance, still in his business suit, his tie undone, his hair disheveled. Isabella stood frozen in the center of the room, her feet still in ballet position, her arms suspended in the air as if the music were still flowing through them. Chopin's nocturne continued to play softly on the sound system, filling the tense silence that had settled between them. Isabella's eyes widened in shock and horror as she realized she had been discovered. Her face, which moments before radiated the confidence of an artist in her element, now flushed deep red. Alexander could see the fear growing in her dark eyes, the panic of an employee who had been caught doing something she clearly thought was forbidden. But Alexander could not move, could not speak. All he could do was look at this woman who had completely transformed before his eyes, wondering how he had been so blind, so deaf, so dead to the life that he had completely lost sight of such beauty in his own home. The music continued, the final notes of the nocturne floating between them like a bridge either of them knew how to cross. The sound of the music abruptly ceased as Isabella lunged toward the sound system, her trembling fingers desperately groping for the controls. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy as a tombstone over the magical moment that had been shattered by reality. I'm so sorry, Mr. Sterling," Isabella stammered, her voice barely a strangled whisper. Her hands shook violently as she tried to find the right button, her graceful coordination for moments before completely vanished. "I didn't know you had returned, I thought." The words died in her throat as she finally managed to silence the music. The ghostly echo of the last notes of Chopin still seemed to float through the air, but now it sounded like an accusation. Isabella turned to face him, her dark eyes wide with terror, like a child caught stealing candy. "I was finishing my cleaning tasks," she began, her voice rising an octave in a desperate attempt to explain the inexplicable. "You said you would return only after midnight and I just..." She swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears she struggled to contain. "I've never done this before, sir. I swear I've never done this before." Alexander remained still at the entrance, his icy blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made Isabella feel as if she were being dissected. Every second of his silence was like a blade cutting through her soul. She could see the cold analysis in his eyes, the same look he likely reserved for incompetent executives before ruining their careers. I didn't touch anything," Isabella continued, her words coming out in desperate bursts. "I just used the sound, and I was going to clean everything, leave everything exactly as it was. Please, Mr. Sterling, I know I shouldn't be here, I know I've crossed the line, but please." She moved frantically around the room, gathering cleaning supplies that weren't even there. Her movements were erratic, desperate, completely different from the fluid grace she had displayed in the dance. Alexander watched as she bent to pick up a cloth that had fallen, her hands shaking so much that she could barely hold it. "I can explain," she said, her voice breaking. "I danced when I was younger, before my mother died, and sometimes I miss it. But I never thought it would hurt anyone, I never thought it would cause problems. I know it was inappropriate, I know a staff member shouldn't." Alexander remained silent, and that silence was more terrifying than any scream could be. Isabella could see the rigidity in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. She recognized that posture. It was the same one he took when he was about to fire someone. "Please, Mr. Sterling," she whispered, her tears finally overflowing. "I need this job. My brother, he's only 15, he's in school, and I'm all he has. If I lose this job, I don't know how we will survive. I can't even afford my own apartment with what I earn elsewhere." She moved toward the door, assuming he wanted her to leave immediately. Her bare feet made soft sounds against the marble, a painful contrast to the music that had filled the space moments before. Alexander could see how she tried to make herself smaller, less visible, as if she could disappear if she tried hard enough. "I'm going to my room now," she said, her voice barely audible. "I understand if you want me to leave in the morning. I won't cause any trouble, I won't ask for references, I won't tell anyone about this." Isabella stopped at the entrance of the room, her shoulders hunched under the weight of humiliation. Alexander could see the tears silently streaming down her face, but she made no sound. Even in her despair, she maintained that quiet quality he had noticed from the first day, as if she had learned to suffer without disturbing others. "I want you to know," she continued, still facing away from him, "that I have always respected this house, always respected you. I know what I did was unforgivable, using your things, being in your private room. I know I broke your trust, and that kills me." She turned slightly, just enough for him to see her profile. Her cheeks were wet, but there was a dignity in her bearing that touched something deep in Alexander's chest. Even in her shame, even in her terror, she was not humiliating herself. She was genuinely apologizing, taking responsibility, protecting his integrity even as she awaited destruction. "I am grateful for the 2 years I was able to work here," she whispered. It was the best job I've ever had, and not just because of the salary. You have always treated me with respect, you have always been fair with me. I ruined that, and I am so sorry." Alexander felt something twist in his stomach. There was a purity in her pain that made him uncomfortable, an honesty that cut through all the defenses he had built. He was used to employees who lied, who made excuses, who tried to manipulate situations to their advantage. But Isabella was simply being real. She began to move toward the door, her steps slow and heavy like someone walking to their own execution. Alexander could see how she struggled to maintain her composure, how she didn't want to completely break down in front of him. There was a strength in her fragility that he couldn't stop observing. "Mr. Sterling," she said, stopping at the entrance without turning around. Her voice was just a whisper, but each word was clear. "I know you probably think I'm just a maid who doesn't know her place. But dancing is who I am. It was the only thing left of my mother, the only thing that makes me feel like I'm still a person, not just an employee." She took a deep breath, gathering courage for her final words. "I will never bother you again. I promise." The vulnerability in her final voice was like a punch to Alexander's stomach. He watched her head toward the door, seeing the defeat in every line of her body, and something inside him rebelled against the scene. It wasn't pity. Alexander Sterling did not feel pity. It was something more dangerous, something he hadn't felt in years. It was recognition. The recognition of a soul that had been forced to hide its true nature to survive, just as he had done in his own journey to the top. Isabella stopped at the entrance, waiting for her final condemnation, and Alexander felt the words forming in his throat, words that could change everything, or destroy the walls he had so carefully built around his controlled life. Isabella froze with her hand on the doorknob, her heart racing as if she had been electrocuted. Alexander's voice had sliced through the tense silence like a warm blade, but there was something in it that she had never heard before, a softness that made the words sound almost human. "Where did you learn to move like that?" The words echoed in the air between them, laden with a curiosity that Isabella couldn't decipher. She remained still, her back to him, her breath caught in her throat as she tried to process what she had just heard. There was no anger in his voice. There was none of the cutting coldness she had expected. There was something that sounded dangerously close to genuine interest. Slowly, very slowly, Isabella turned to face him. Her fingers still clutched the cleaning supplies against her chest like a shield, her wide, frightened eyes searching for signs of a trap. Alexander Sterling did not ask kind questions. Alexander Sterling did not show curiosity about the personal lives of his employees. Alexander Sterling certainly did not speak in that low, almost intimate voice that made something strange happen in her stomach. Sorry," she whispered, her voice wavering. Perhaps she had misheard. Perhaps the shock of the situation had distorted his words in her mind. Alexander stepped into the room, his hands coming out of his pockets. Isabella could see his expression more clearly now, under the golden light of the crystal chandeliers. There was something different in his blue eyes, an intensity that was not the usual coldness, but something deeper, more human. As if a tiny crack had appeared in the perfect mask he always wore. "You heard my question," he said, his voice still holding that smooth quality that made her heart beat irregularly. "Where did you learn to dance like that?" Isabella felt her legs go weak. Was this real? Was he really asking about her dancing instead of shouting at her or handing her a termination letter? She studied his face, searching for signs of sarcasm or disguised cruelty, but found only that intense curiosity that left her completely disoriented. I don't understand," she stammered, her eyes filling with tears again. "Aren't you angry with me?" Alexander tilted his head slightly, and Isabella could see how he was studying every detail of her face with the same intensity she had seen him use when analyzing million-dollar contracts. But this time, there was no coldness in his gaze. There was something she couldn't name, something that made her skin tingle. "I asked a question," he said simply, crossing his arms over his chest. "Where did you learn to dance like that?" Isabella felt as if she were on the edge of a precipice, looking into an abyss that could mean her salvation or her complete destruction. Was he testing her? Was he looking for more reasons to fire her? Or was there really genuine curiosity in his voice? She looked at the cleaning supplies in her hands, then at Alexander's impenetrable face, then at the marble floor where she had danced so freely moments before. Every survival instinct she had developed over the past few years screamed at her to give a safe, dismissive answer that minimized what he had seen. I was just playing around, she could say. It wasn't anything serious. I was just being silly. But when she looked up again, she found those blue eyes still fixed on her, and there was something in them that made the safe words die in her throat. There was an expectant quality in his posture, as if he really wanted to know. As if the answer mattered to him. Isabella felt fresh tears welling in her eyes as a silent battle raged in her heart. She had spent 2 years hiding who she really was, 2 years being just the silent, invisible maid who cleaned his house and disappeared. 2 years denying the truest part of herself. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know if this is a trap or if you really want to know, but I can't play games anymore. I can't pretend that I'm not affected by all of this. Alexander remained still, but Isabella could see something changing in his expression. A softness almost imperceptible around his eyes, a slight relaxation of the jaw muscles. As if he were lowering his own defenses, just a fraction. It's not a trap, he said, and his voice was lower now, more personal. I genuinely want to know. Isabella felt as if the ground were crumbling beneath her feet. She gripped the cleaning supplies tighter, using them as an anchor as she tried to process this new reality. Alexander Sterling, the man she was sure would summarily fire her, was asking her to open up to him. She could feel the moment stretching between them, heavy with possibilities she dared not consider. She could choose safety, give a vague answer, and hope he lost interest. Or she could choose honesty and risk everything with a man who had the power to destroy her life with a word. Isabella looked at the grand piano where she had danced, at the space where she had felt more alive than in years. She looked at her own hands, still trembling, still holding the symbols of who she had become out of necessity. Then she looked at Alexander, standing there in his expensive suit, waiting for her answer with a patience she had never seen from him before. Slowly, she placed the cleaning supplies on the floor beside the door. The gesture was small, but symbolic. She was choosing to be more than just an employee, at least for this moment. Isabella took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs as if it were the first real breath she had taken in years. When she spoke, her voice was low but firm, laden with a vulnerability she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. My mother, she began, and even those 2 words already carried the weight of a lifetime of pain and love. She taught me. The words flowed from Isabella like water through a dam that had finally burst. Once she started, she couldn't stop, years of silence and denial pouring out in a torrent of truths she had buried so deeply that sometimes she forgot they existed. My mother took me to my first ballet class when I was 6 years old, she said, her voice gaining strength as the memories flowed. I was a hyperactive child, always running around the house, always dancing to imaginary music. She said I needed a place to channel all that energy. Alexander remained perfectly still, but Isabella could feel the intensity of his attention like a physical presence. She looked at her hands, avoiding those blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. The Chicago Ballet Academy, she continued, a ghost of a smile crossing her face. I trained there for 12 years. 12 years waking up at 5 in the morning for classes before school, then another 3 hours of training after classes. Whole weekends in the studio. My feet bled inside the slippers, my legs hurt so much I could barely climb stairs, but I loved every second. She shifted slightly, her feet automatically taking the first position even as she spoke. Alexander noticed the movement, the way her body seemed to transform even with that small change in posture. When I was 17, I got a full scholarship, Isabella said, her voice filling with a pride she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. My teacher said I had natural talent, that I had what it took to be a professional dancer. I believed them. God, how I believed them. Tears began to silently stream down her face, but there was a different quality to them now, not just pain, but a kind of painful relief in finally speaking about it. When I graduated, I auditioned for the American Ballet Theater, she whispered, as if the words were too sacred to be spoken aloud. They accepted me into the corps de ballet. I made it. At 18, I had achieved what I had dreamed of since I was a child. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. He could see the young dancer she had been, could imagine the sparkle in her eyes when she received the acceptance news. He could see the years of dedication, of sacrifice, of dreams built brick by brick. I was supposed to start in the fall season, Isabella continued, her voice beginning to tremble. I had already found a tiny apartment in Brooklyn, had all my plans laid out. I was going to be a professional dancer. I was going to dance in the biggest theaters in the world. I was going to. Her voice broke, and she brought a hand to her mouth, as if she could push the words back. Alexander took an involuntary step toward her, then stopped, his fists clenching at his sides. What happened? He asked, his voice gentler than Isabella had ever heard. 3 weeks before I was supposed to start, she whispered. My parents were coming back from a trip to Michigan. They had gone to visit my grandmother, who was ill. It was a rainy night, and a truck skidded on the highway. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The silence said it all. Alexander felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. He had lost his own parents, of natural causes, after a long and well-lived life, and yet the pain had been unbearable. He couldn't imagine losing both at once, so young, at the height of his own dreams. Marcus was 16, Isabella continued, her voice taking on a mechanical quality, as if she were reciting facts she had memorized to survive. He was in his senior year of high school, had dreams of going to college. Someone had to take care of him. Someone had to pay the bills, buy food, make sure he finished school. She looked at Alexander for the first time since she had started speaking, and he could see the raw devastation in her eyes. I had to choose, she said simply. My dreams or my brother. There was no other option. Alexander felt something twist in his stomach. He, who had sacrificed relationships and personal happiness in the name of ambition, couldn't imagine sacrificing his ambition in the name of love for another person. I called the American Ballet Theater and said I couldn't accept the position, Isabella continued, each word coming out as if she were tearing pieces from her soul. I took 3 jobs, cleaning during the day, waitressing at night, and working in a laundromat on weekends. Anything to keep Marcus in school and put food on the table. And you never danced again? Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. Isabella laughed, but it was a sound devoid of humor, filled with self-inflicted pain. I tried to stop completely, she admitted. I thought it would be easier to forget, you know? But dancing isn't just something I do. It's who I am deep in my soul. So I practice in secret sometimes. In empty apartments when I'm cleaning, in hotel rooms when I'm working, and sometimes here, when I think no one will see. She looked at the grand piano, then back at Alexander. Marcus is at Northwestern University now, she said, and for the first time there was genuine pride in her voice. He's studying engineering, has a scholarship, will graduate next year. He doesn't know what I gave up for him. He thinks I always wanted to be a homemaker, that I never had bigger ambitions. Alexander could see the pain this caused her, having to hide who she really was even from the person she loved most. He sometimes asks me why I don't have a boyfriend, why I don't have my own life. Isabella continued. I say I'm happy, that I'm focused on work. But the truth is, I don't know how to be anything other than the person who takes care of everyone, who works in silence, who has no dreams of her own. She took a deep breath, as if emerging from deep waters. Except when I dance, she whispered. When I dance, I remember who I was. Who I could have been. The silence that followed was deep and heavy. Alexander studied her with an intensity that made Isabella feel exposed, as if he could see every scar on her soul. She could see something changing in his face, the coldness fading, replaced by something she couldn't name. How old are you now? He asked softly. 27, she replied, and Alexander could do the math. 8 years. 8 years since she had given up her dreams, 8 years living a life that wasn't hers. You're still young, he said, and there was something strange in his voice. You could still. No, Isabella interrupted, shaking her head. I'm 27, Mr. Sterling. In the ballet world, I'm an old woman. My body isn't the same anymore, my reflexes aren't the same. That train left a long time ago. Alexander could see the resignation in her eyes, the way she had accepted that her dreams were dead and buried. But he could also see something more, a small but persistent flame that refused to be completely extinguished. Isabella suddenly realized what she had done. She had opened up completely to her employer, had poured her soul out to a man who had the power to destroy her life. She had crossed all the lines she had carefully drawn to keep her position secure. I don't know why I told you all this, she stammered, panic returning to her voice. I shouldn't have, this isn't appropriate. I'm your employee and She began to move toward the cleaning supplies, desperate to return to the safe roles she knew. But Alexander could see what she was doing, hiding behind the tools of her work, trying to make herself invisible again. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither dared to name. Isabella had fully revealed herself, and now it remained to be seen what Alexander Sterling would do with her vulnerability. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled to its limit, and Isabella could feel each beat of her heart echoing in her ears. She was about to bend down to grab the cleaning supplies when Alexander spoke, his voice so low that she could barely hear. Sarah was also a dancer. The words fell into the air like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread through the silence. Isabella froze, one hand outstretched toward the cleaning spray, her eyes slowly rising to meet his. My wife, Alexander continued, and there was a different quality to his voice, now softer, more human. She was a dancer. Isabella straightened slowly, her heart racing for a completely different reason now. In 2 years of working in this house, she had never seen a single photo of a woman, never heard Alexander mention even once that he had been married. The whole house seemed to exist in an emotional vacuum, as if he had been born fully formed and alone. Did she dance professionally? Isabella asked hesitantly, unsure if he wanted to keep talking or if it had just been a moment of weakness. Alexander moved to the window, his hands clenching into fists behind his back. Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held his body as if bracing for a blow. She danced at the Chicago Ballet, he said, and Isabella felt a jolt of recognition. Not as a soloist, but she was part of the corps de ballet. She was trying to climb the ranks when we met. Isabella could imagine a determined young dancer, perhaps with the same dreams she had once had, the same passion burning in her eyes. She felt a strange pang in her chest, something that could have been jealousy if it weren't so mixed with a deep sadness. How did you meet? She asked softly. Alexander smiled, but it was a ghostly smile, full of pain and longing. I was young, arrogant, thought I could conquer the business world, he said. But I also had this side that longed for beauty, for art. I used to go to the theater, to ballets. That's where I saw her for the first time. He paused, lost in memories that Isabella could see playing across his face. She was like light in motion, he continued. I couldn't take my eyes off her. After the show, I found a way to meet her, and she laughed at my awkward attempt to impress her with my knowledge of ballet. Isabella could picture the scene, a young Alexander, probably trying to use his wealth and intelligence to impress an artist, only to find out she was immune to his usual tactics. We dated for 2 years before we got married, Alexander said. She kept dancing even after the wedding. I used to watch her practice. His voice became softer, more intimate, as if he were speaking more to himself than to Isabella. I had a studio built for her on the 3rd floor, he admitted. Mirrors, bars, the right floor. She spent hours there, and I would sometimes go up just to sit and watch. She said I made her nervous, but I could see she liked the audience. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. She could imagine the intimacy of those moments, the way Alexander's love for his wife had manifested through his appreciation for her art. What happened? She asked, though she feared the answer. Alexander was silent for a long moment, his breathing becoming uneven. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "Skiing," he said. "She loved to ski. We would go to Aspen every winter, it was our tradition. She was even good at it, but 5 years ago, she wanted to try a run that was beyond her level. I said it was dangerous, that we should stick to the easier slopes." Isabella could see the muscles in his jaw clenching, the way he was fighting against the pain that was still as alive as it had been on the first day. "But she laughed and said I was being overprotective," he continued. "She said dancers were athletes, that she could handle any physical challenge. And I didn't want to be the controlling husband, so I let her." The silence that followed was heavy with a weight that Isabella could feel in her bones. She knew she was about to hear something that would forever change the way she saw Alexander Sterling. "She hit a tree," he said simply. "Died instantly. The doctors said she didn't suffer, but I wasn't there. I was on the easier slope, waiting for her, and she died alone." Isabella brought a hand to her mouth, tears streaming freely down her face now. She could imagine the guilt he carried, the way he blamed himself for not insisting more, for not being there. "After that," Alexander continued, his voice becoming more mechanical, I couldn't bear reminders of beauty, of art, of anything that reminded me of her. I had the dance studio closed, removed all the photos, got rid of all her things." Isabella looked around the room, seeing it with new eyes. The sterility, the coldness, the complete absence of personality, they weren't aesthetic choices. They were open wounds. "I forbade myself from going to ballets, museums, anything that could remind me of what I had lost," he admitted. "I thought that if I eliminated all the beauty from my life, the pain would stop." "And did it stop?" Isabella asked softly. Alexander finally turned to look at her, and Isabella could see tears in his eyes, the first tears she had seen in someone so powerful, so seemingly invincible. "No," he said. It just became deeper, lonelier. But I had built this whole life around her absence, and I didn't know how to live any other way." Isabella felt her heart breaking for him. She could imagine the last 5 years, Alexander building higher and higher walls around his heart, becoming colder and more distant to avoid feeling the devastating pain of his loss. "But today," he continued, his voice gaining a different quality, "when I saw you dancing, it was as if someone had lit a candle in a room that had been dark for 5 years. Isabella stopped breathing. "I thought seeing someone dance again would be unbearable," Alexander said, taking a step toward her. "I thought it would bring back all the pain, all the longing. But instead I felt something I hadn't felt in so long that I had forgotten what it was." "What did you feel?" Isabella whispered. "Hope," he said, and the word hung in the air between them like a prayer. "For the first time in 5 years I felt hope." Isabella could see the raw vulnerability in his eyes, the way he was completely exposing himself to her just as she had exposed herself to him. She could see the man behind the cold mask, the man who had loved deeply and lost everything. "I couldn't understand," Alexander continued. "Why watching you dance didn't tear me apart. Why, instead of pain, I felt like I was waking up from a very long sleep." Isabella could feel something shifting in the air between them, something deep and fundamental moving. This was no longer the cold, distant employer she had known for 2 years. This was a man who had suffered, who had lost, who had hidden from his own humanity for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to be truly alive. "Mr. Sterling," she began, but he interrupted her. "Alexander," he said softly. "My name is Alexander." Isabella felt as if the world had tilted slightly on its axis. She was seeing Alexander Sterling, not the business magnate, not the demanding employer, but the man for the first time. And he was completely different from anything she had imagined. The night had passed like a whirlwind of emotions for Isabella. She had stayed awake until the early hours of the morning, lying in her small bed in the apartment she shared with 2 other women, staring at the cracked ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. Alexander's confessions, The vulnerability she had seen in his eyes, the way he had said her name as if it were a prayer, all of this spun in her mind like a kaleidoscope of possibilities that she dared not examine too closely. When she finally fell asleep, her dreams were filled with music and movement, of a young dancer who was herself but also Sarah, dancing in a studio of mirrors that stretched into infinity. Morning arrived cold and gray, typical of Chicago in the fall. Isabella dressed with extra care, choosing her most impeccable uniform, as if she could hide behind the armor of her professionalism. She had crossed all the lines the night before, had exposed herself in a way that could cost her everything. Now, in the raw light of day, she was prepared for the consequences. The phone rang at 8 in the morning, just as she was finishing preparing Alexander's breakfast. His voice through the intercom was formal, distant. The employer she knew had returned. "Isabella, I need to speak with you in my office as soon as possible." She felt her stomach drop. So this was it. She had exposed herself too much, had forgotten her place, and now Alexander Sterling was about to cut all the ties that had begun to form between them. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," she replied, her voice professional despite the panic in her chest. She walked through the hallways of the mansion as if she were heading to her own execution. Each step echoed on the cold marble, each breath felt harder than the last. When she reached the study door, she paused for a moment, closing her eyes and preparing for what was to come. Alexander was standing behind his desk, turning his back to the door when she entered. He wore an impeccable suit, every hair in place, all the vulnerability of the previous night carefully hidden behind the mask of authority he wore as armor. "Close the door," he said without turning around. Isabella did as requested, her hands trembling slightly. She stood near the door, waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to end the agony of waiting. "Sit down," Alexander said, finally turning to look at her. Isabella carefully moved to the chair in front of the desk, sitting on the edge as if she were ready to jump up and run at any moment. She kept her eyes down, focusing on her carefully folded hands in her lap. "I spent the whole night thinking about our conversation," Alexander began, his voice deliberately controlled. "About the things we both revealed." Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. She knew what was coming: the polite dismissal, the reference that would ensure she found another job, the maintenance of the proper distance between employer and employee. "I know I crossed boundaries," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I know I shouldn't have." "Isabella," Alexander interrupted her, and there was something different in his voice. "Look at me." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to meet his. What she saw there was not coldness or disappointment, but something that made her heart stop for a moment. "I called the Chicago Ballet Academy this morning," he said. Isabella blinked, confused. I don't understand." Alexander moved to the side of the desk, leaning against it in a posture that was more casual than she had ever seen. He held an envelope in his hands, and Isabella could see that he was nervous, genuinely nervous. "I spoke with the artistic director, Margaret Harrison," he continued. "I told her about you, about your training, about what you sacrificed." Isabella felt as if the world was tilting on its axis. "Mr. Sterling, I don't understand what you are." "They want you to audition for their advanced program," Alexander said, and the words came out in a rush, as if he were afraid of losing his courage if he stopped. "For dancers who want to return to professional ballet." Isabella stopped breathing completely. She looked at Alexander as if he had just spoken in a foreign language. This is impossible," she whispered. I don't have the money to." "I will pay," Alexander said simply. The words hung in the air between them like a bomb that had yet to explode. Isabella could hear her own heart beating in her ears, could feel the blood running through her veins like fire. "You will, what?" she managed to say. Alexander moved to the window, his hands clenching into fists behind his back, the same posture he had adopted the night before when he was struggling with emotions that were too big to contain. "I will pay for your classes, for your equipment, for everything you need," he said. "And if you are accepted into the program, I will continue paying until you are ready for professional auditions." Isabella felt as if she couldn't breathe. She looked at the envelope in Alexander's hands, then at his face, trying to find some sign that this was a cruel joke. "I can't accept this," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I can't, this is too much. And Marcus, he still has a year in college, and I need to." "Marcus has a full scholarship now," Alexander interrupted her. Isabella felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. "What did you say?" "I established a scholarship fund at Northwestern," Alexander explained, finally turning to look at her. "Marcus Sterling's scholarship fund. It will cover not only his tuition but also housing, food, books, everything." Isabella abruptly stood up, walking away from the desk as if she needed to move to process what she was hearing. "You can't do this," she said, her voice rising. "You can't just change my whole life without asking me." "I am asking now," Alexander said calmly. Isabella turned to look at him, tears streaming freely down her face now. "Why?" she asked, and there was a desperate quality in her voice. "Why would you do this? What do you want from me?" Alexander was silent for a long moment, struggling with words that were too difficult to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with an honesty that made Isabella stop crying. "Because I need to believe that beauty and dreams can still exist in the world," he said. "Because I need to believe that not everything is lost, that there is still hope." He took a step toward her, his mask finally falling completely. "I don't know how to heal from the loss of Sarah," he admitted. "I don't know how to live again. But maybe by helping you find your dreams again, I can find a way to move on." Isabella could see the raw vulnerability in his eyes, the way he was exposing himself completely to her. She could see that this was not about charity or guilt, it was about mutual hope, about two broken people trying to find a way to become whole again. "You are scared," she whispered, and it was not a question. "I am terrified," Alexander admitted. "I am terrified that you will say no. I am terrified that you will say yes. I am terrified of feeling hope again and finding out that I was wrong." Isabella could feel something changing in her chest, something that had been dormant for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like. It was as if a door that had been locked for 8 years was finally opening. "What if I fail?" she asked. "What if I am not good enough anymore? What if I waste all your money and achieve nothing?" "Then at least you will have tried," Alexander said. "At least you will have given yourself the chance to find out." Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the tears burning her cheeks. She could hear music in her mind, could feel her muscles remembering movements she had practiced in secret for so many years. She could feel the young dancer she had been waking from a long sleep. "I am so scared," she whispered. "I know," Alexander said softly. "So am I." Isabella opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him. She could see the man who had loved deeply and lost everything, the man who was offering her a chance to return to life because he needed to believe that it was still possible. "If I say yes," she said, her voice trembling, "everything will change. I can no longer be your employee. I can no longer just exist in silence." "I know," Alexander said. "I am counting on that." Isabella felt as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, looking into an abyss that could either contain her completely or give her wings to fly. She thought of Marcus, safe in college. She thought of 8 years of buried dreams. She thought of the 6-year-old girl who had walked into her first ballet class with eyes shining with possibility. "Yes," she whispered, and the word came out like a prayer. Alexander closed his eyes as if he had just received an absolution. "Yes," Isabella said again, stronger this time. "Yes, I accept." They stood facing each other, two strangers who had become something more, two wounded hearts that had found a way to begin healing together. Isabella could feel that her life was about to change in a way she couldn't even imagine, and for the first time in 8 years, she wasn't afraid of the change. She was ready to dance again. The first days at the Chicago Ballet Academy were a brutal shock to Isabella's system. She had imagined it would be difficult, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of being back in a studio, surrounded by relentless mirrors reflecting every imperfection, every hesitant movement. The first class was a silent humiliation. Isabella arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a new leotard that Alexander had insisted she buy, pale pink with lace details, elegant and expensive. She felt like an imposter as she adjusted her ballet shoes, her fingers automatically remembering how to tie the ribbons even after so many years. The studio was filled with young, perfect bodies, dancers aged 18, 19, 20 who moved with a fluidity that made Isabella feel as if she were made of wood. She could feel the curious glances, the silent evaluations. She was clearly the oldest in the class, and everyone knew it. Isabella Rodriguez? The instructor's voice, Madame Petrov, cut through the air like a blade. You are our new student? Isabella nodded, her throat too dry for words. Madame Petrov was a Russian woman in her 60s, with silver hair neatly pinned in a bun and eyes that seemed capable of seeing through the soul. Position at the bar, Madame Petrov instructed. Let's see what you remember. The first plies were torture. Muscles Isabella didn't even know existed screamed in protest, her legs trembling with the effort of holding positions that had once been automatic. She could feel the sweat trickling down her back, could hear her heavy breathing echoing in the silence of the studio. Deeper, Madame Petrov ordered, her cane tapping the floor to mark the rhythm. You are not a beginner. Your body remembers, even if your mind has forgotten. Isabella tried to sink deeper into the movement, but her legs trembled violently, and she almost fell. Stifled laughter echoed behind her, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Silence, Madame Petrov growled at the other students. You all were beginners once. Respect is the first lesson in this studio. Isabella managed to finish the class, but when she reached the locker room, she could barely walk. Every muscle in her body throbbed with pain, and she sat on the bench, trembling not only from exhaustion but from a devastating realization: she had lost everything. 8 years was an eternity in the dance world, and now she was trying to reclaim what she had lost at an age when most dancers were already considering retirement. But she returned the next day, and the day after that. Weeks turned into months, and Isabella discovered there were 2 types of pain in her journey: the physical pain, which was constant and relentless, and the emotional pain, which came in devastating waves when she least expected it. There were days when she stood at the bar, trying to execute a grand battement that had been simple when she was 20, and her legs simply refused to cooperate. There were days when she attempted a triple pirouette, and could barely complete a turn without losing her balance. There were days when she looked in the mirror and saw not a dancer, but a 28-year-old woman who had lost her best years to need and fear. In December, 3 months after starting classes, Isabella was rehearsing alone in the studio after lessons when she noticed a familiar figure at the door. Alexander was standing there, wearing a dark overcoat, snow melting in his hair. He said nothing, just watched as she worked on an adagio sequence that Madame Petrov had taught that day. Isabella stopped mid-movement, suddenly aware of every imperfection. You don't have to stop, Alexander said softly. I wanted to see how you were progressing. Isabella felt her cheeks flush. She knew she was still far from the level she needed to reach, knew that every movement still carried the stiffness of muscles that had been forced to remember what they had forgotten. I'm not good enough yet, she said, her voice echoing in the empty studio. I don't know if I ever will be. Alexander stepped into the studio, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. You're different, he said. Stronger. More present. Isabella looked at him in the mirror, seeing the 2 of them reflected side by side, her in her sweaty leotard and him in his impeccable suit, 2 worlds that shouldn't meet but had become inseparable. Do you come here often? She asked. Sometimes, Alexander admitted. When work allows. I like watching you dance. There was something in the way he said it that made Isabella's heart race. She could see in the mirror how he looked at her, and it was the same expression he had described when talking about watching Sarah practice. You're thinking about her, Isabella said, and it wasn't a question. Alexander was silent for a long moment. Yes, he finally admitted. But not in the way you think. Isabella turned to look at him directly, not through the mirror. Watching Sarah dance used to make me feel like I was witnessing something sacred, Alexander explained. Something I could never touch or fully understand, but that I was privileged to witness. He paused, struggling with words that were hard to say. Watching you dance makes me feel like I'm watching someone become who she was always meant to be, he continued. It's different. It's hope in motion. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. She could see the truth in his face, could feel the sincerity in his words. I'm so afraid of disappointing you, she whispered. Impossible, Alexander said firmly. You've already done more than I thought anyone could do. You've already proven that miracles still happen. In February, Isabella had her first true breakdown. She was in a variations class, trying to master a solo from the second act of Giselle, when something broke inside her. She had tried the same jump 15 times, and 15 times had landed wrong, her technique betraying her at the crucial moment. Again, Madame Petrov said, her voice impatient. You're overthinking it. Let your body remember. Isabella tried again, but this time she couldn't even leave the ground properly. She landed with a heavy thud, and something inside her simply crumbled. I can't, she said, her voice breaking. I can't do this. You can't, Madame Petrov insisted. You just need to. No! Isabella shouted, and the sound echoed through the studio like a gunshot. I can't! I'm too old, I've waited too long, I've lost my chance. She ran out of the studio, pushing the double doors with such force that they slammed against the walls. She ran through the hallways of the academy, tears streaming down her face, until she reached the locker room where she collapsed on a bench and cried like she hadn't cried in years. She was sitting there, still trembling with sobs, when she heard soft footsteps in the hallway. The door opened, and Alexander appeared, his face filled with concern. Isabella? He said gently. She looked at him through her tears, seeing his worried expression, and felt even worse. I've wasted your money, she said, her voice hoarse from crying. I've wasted your faith in me. I can't do this. Alexander approached carefully, as if she were a wounded animal that might flee at any moment. He sat on the bench beside her, keeping a respectful distance. Do you know how many people give up on their dreams? He asked softly. Isabella shook her head, not trusting her voice. Millions, Alexander said. Millions of people let life, circumstances, fear convince them that their dreams are impossible. They stop trying, stop hoping, stop believing. He paused, looking at his own hands. I was one of those people, he admitted. After Sarah died, I stopped believing in beauty, in art, in anything that made life worth living. I convinced myself it was safer to just exist. Isabella could hear the pain in his voice, could feel the weight of his confession. But you, he continued, finally looking at her, you are fighting for the right to dream again. You are facing each day of pain, each moment of doubt, each voice that says it's too late. Fresh tears streamed down Isabella's face. And when you fight, Alexander said, when you refuse to give up, you are fighting not just for yourself, but for all of us who have forgotten how to hope. Isabella felt something shift in her chest, a spark of determination she had thought was lost forever. I don't know if I can be good enough, she whispered. You don't need to be perfect, Alexander said. You just need to be you. You just need to keep trying. Isabella wiped the tears from her face and looked at him, really looked at him. She could see the faith he had in her, could feel the strength he was offering. Will you stay? She asked. Will you watch the rest of the class? Alexander smiled, a real, warm smile that completely transformed his face. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Isabella stood up, her legs still trembling, but her determination stronger than it had been in months. She returned to the studio, Alexander following at a respectful distance, and asked Madame Petrov to start the music again. This time, when she jumped, she was thinking about hope, about second chances, about all the dreams that had been buried but could still bloom. She hadn't landed perfectly yet, but she had landed. And on Alexander's face she could see that this was more than enough. The following months were a mix of slow progress and moments of pure magic. Isabella began to feel her body responding in ways she had forgotten were possible. Her muscles grew stronger, Her flexibility gradually returned, and more importantly, her confidence started to come back. In April, 6 months after starting her training, Isabella was in the studio when Madame Petrov walked in with an expression she had never seen before. "Isabella," she said, and there was something different in her voice. "I need to talk to you." Isabella felt her heart race. She had made so much progress, but there was still so much work to do. She hoped it wasn't another critique, another reminder of how far she still was from her goals. "Margaret Harrison from the Chicago Ballet Company watched your class yesterday," Madame Petrov said. Isabella stopped breathing. Margaret Harrison was a legend in the dance world, a woman who had shaped careers and shattered dreams with equal ease. "She wants to see you in her office tomorrow at 2 o'clock, Madame Petrov continued. "She has a proposal for you." Isabella felt as if the world had stopped spinning. "A proposal?" Madame Petrov smiled the first time Isabella had seen the Russian woman show real emotion. "They want you to audition for the Corps de Ballet," she said. "And if you are accepted, they have a specific role in mind." Isabella held onto the bar to keep from falling. "What role?" she managed to ask. "Giselle," Madame Petrov said simply. "They want you to dance Giselle in the summer production." Isabella felt as if she had been struck by lightning. Giselle, the role she had dreamed of as a child, the role she had practiced in secret for so many years, the role that represented everything she had lost and everything she hoped to regain. She began, but couldn't find the words. "You will," Madame Petrov said, and there was a fierce pride in her voice. "You will because you deserve it. You will because you fought for it. You will because you reminded the world that it is never too late to achieve a dream." Isabella felt tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of pure joy, of hope realized, of a dream that refused to die. She had come back. Against all odds, she had found her way back home. The opening night of Giselle at the Chicago Ballet Company arrived with a storm of emotions that Isabella had not anticipated. She had spent the last 3 months rehearsing intensively, each movement etched into her muscle memory until they became as natural as breathing. But now, standing in the dressing room of the Chicago Opera House, looking at her reflection in the mirror surrounded by bright lights, she felt as if she were about to awaken from a long and impossible dream. Giselle's costume was a delicate confection of white tulle and silk, with a hand-embroidered bodice that shimmered softly under the lights. Isabella touched the fabric with trembling fingers, still unable to believe she was there, that after 8 years of sacrifice and abandonment, she was about to dance the role that had haunted her dreams. 5 minutes to places. The stage manager's voice echoed through the corridors, and Isabella felt her heart race until she could hear it pounding in her ears. There were flowers everywhere in her dressing room, red roses from Alexander, yellow daisies from Marcus, and a single white rose without a card that she suspected had come from Madame Petrov. The air was scented with the sweet fragrance of flowers and the familiar smell of stage makeup and hairspray. Isabella closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that made her hands shake. She could hear the orchestra tuning in the pit, could feel the electric energy that always preceded a live performance. This energy was something she had forgotten, something that no amount of solitary rehearsal in empty studios could recreate. A soft knock on the door made her open her eyes. "Isabella?" It was Margaret Harrison, the artistic director, her voice carrying the mix of authority and maternal warmth that had made her a legendary figure in the dance world. "Come in," Isabella said, her voice stronger than she expected. Margaret entered, elegant in her black evening gown, her silver hair styled in a sophisticated chignon. She looked at Isabella with eyes that had seen thousands of dancers, but that sparkled with something special in this moment. "How are you feeling?" Margaret asked. Isabella considered lying, saying she was confident and ready. But there was something in Margaret's gentle gaze that made her choose the truth. "Terrified," Isabella admitted. "And more alive than I've felt in years." Margaret smiled, and Isabella could see that she completely understood. "That's the perfect combination," Margaret said. "The fear will keep you focused, and the joy will allow you to soar." She stepped closer and placed her hands on Isabella's shoulders, looking directly into her eyes. "You've worked for this," Margaret said firmly. "You deserve to be here. Now go out there and remind the world why dance exists." Isabella felt a wave of determination wash over her. She nodded, not trusting her voice to respond. "Places, everyone! Places for Act 1! Isabella took one last look at her reflection, seeing not the timid governess she had been, but the artist she had always been destined to be. She left the dressing room and walked through the theater corridors, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor, until she reached the side wings. The stage was lit with a soft, golden light that suggested dawn in the village where Giselle lived. Isabella could see the bucolic set design, could feel the warmth of the stage lights, could hear the murmur of the audience settling into their seats. She peeked through a crack in the curtain, and her heart nearly stopped. The theater was packed, every seat filled with people dressed in their finest clothes. But her eyes were immediately drawn to the front row, where Alexander Sterling was sitting. He wore a pristine tuxedo, his hair perfectly styled, but Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists in his lap. Beside him, Marcus was sitting with some college friends, all clearly impressed to be there. Isabella felt a wave of emotion so strong that she had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. Alexander had made this happen. He had made it possible for her to be here, for Marcus to watch his sister dance, for dreams that had seemed dead to be resurrected. Isabella. The voice of her partner, David Chin, a graceful and experienced principal dancer, brought her back to the present moment. "Are you ready?" Isabella turned to look at him, seeing the calm confidence in his eyes, the perfect posture that spoke of years of training and discipline. "I'm ready," she said, and for the first time, she truly believed it. The music began the first sweet and melancholic notes that opened Giselle, and Isabella felt all the nervousness leave her body. She was no longer Isabella Rodriguez, the governess who had abandoned her dreams. She was Giselle, the passionate young peasant about to live the most beautiful and tragic story in the classical repertoire. She stepped onto the stage with light and bouncy steps, her presence immediately filling the space. The bright lights enveloped her like a hug, and she could feel the attention of 1,000 people focused on her. But instead of feeling intimidated, she felt energized. She felt at home. The first scene passed like a dream. Isabella danced with a joy and lightness she hadn't felt in years, her body responding to the music as if she had never stopped. Every movement was imbued with real emotion, every gesture telling the story of a young woman who loved with all her heart. When the moment of the famous flower variation in the first act arrived, Isabella positioned herself in the center of the stage and felt the whole world disappear. There was only her, the music, and the movement. She leaped and spun with a grace that surprised even herself, her body recalling skills she had thought were lost forever. In the audience, Alexander watched with an expression of absolute fascination. Isabella could see him occasionally when the choreography brought her to the front of the stage, and each time their eyes met, she could see tears glistening on his face. He was not trying to hide them, not trying to maintain composure. He was simply being carried away by the beauty of the moment. Marcus was leaning forward in his seat, his eyes shining with pride and admiration. Isabella could see that he could hardly believe that this was his sister on stage, the same person who had worked as a governess to pay for her studies. The first act culminated in Giselle's mad scene, the moment when she discovers that her beloved Albrecht is actually a disguised nobleman who is engaged to another. Isabella channeled all the pain of her own sacrifices, all the anguish of lost dreams, to create a devastating portrait of a broken heart. She danced her madness with a raw vulnerability that made the entire audience hold their breath. Every movement was an expression of pain, every gesture a silent scream of betrayal. When she finally collapsed on stage, dying of heartbreak, the silence in the theater was absolute. The first act ended with an ovation that made the theater walls vibrate. Isabella, still lying on the stage, could hear the sound of applause like a tsunami of approval. When she got up to take her bow, the people in the audience stood up too, and she found herself in the center of a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. She searched for Alexander in the audience, and saw that he was standing, applauding with tears streaming freely down his face. Beside him, Marcus was shouting, "That's my sister!" with a joy that made Isabella laugh through her own tears. The second act, where Giselle returns as a spirit to protect Albrecht from vengeful Willis, was even more magical. Isabella danced with an ethereal quality that transformed the stage into a supernatural realm. Her movements were like whispers of wind, her presence both powerful and delicate. The final pas de deux with David was a masterpiece of storytelling through dance. Isabella managed to convey all of Giselle's forgiven love, all the grace of a spirit that chooses love over revenge. When she executed the delicate lifts and the arabesque poses that defined the choreography, it felt as if she were truly floating. The final scene, where Giselle must return to her grave at dawn, was laden with a melancholic beauty that left the audience in reverent silence. Isabella danced her farewell with an elegance that seemed to come from somewhere beyond technique, beyond training. She danced with her soul. When the curtain fell for the last time, the theater erupted in applause. Isabella remained on stage, breathing heavily, hardly believing it was over. She had done it. She had danced Giselle, had lived the dream she had carried in her heart for over a decade. The curtains opened again for the curtain calls, and Isabella went to the center of the stage to receive an ovation that seemed endless. Flowers were thrown onto the stage, and she gathered them with trembling hands, each rose a validation that she had succeeded. David brought her to the front of the stage, and together they took bow after bow. Isabella searched for Alexander in the audience, and saw that he was standing, his hands pressed against his heart, as if trying to contain the emotion that threatened to overflow. Finally, the curtains closed for the last time, and Isabella found herself surrounded by cast and crew members, all offering congratulations and hugs. But she could hardly process the words. She was in a post-performance shock, that unique feeling that comes after giving everything on stage. "Isabella!" Margaret Harrison's voice cut through the chaos. "Absolutely extraordinary." Isabella turned to see the artistic director approaching, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," Isabella managed to say. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity." "You earned this opportunity," Margaret said firmly. "And you seized it in a way that few artists can. You didn't just dance Giselle, you became Giselle." Isabella felt a new wave of emotion, but before she could respond, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Isabella." She turned to see Alexander standing there, still in his tuxedo, his eyes red but shining with something she had never seen before. "Alexander," she said, and her voice came out as a whisper. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two people who had gone through an impossible journey together. Isabella could see everything on his face: pride, admiration, and something deeper that made her feel as if she were melting. "You were," he began, but his voice faltered. Isabella completely forgot where she was, forgot the protocol, forgot everything except the man who had made this moment possible. She ran to him and hugged him tightly, feeling his arms wrap around her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you for giving me my life back." Alexander held her tighter, and she could feel him trembling. "Isabella," he said softly, his words meant only for her. "You brought back the beauty that my home and my heart had forgotten." Isabella pulled back enough to look into his eyes, and saw a transformation there that mirrored her own. He was no longer the broken man she had known, just as she was no longer the woman who had buried her dreams. They had healed each other without even realizing it. "We did this," she said, smiling through her tears. "We found our way back." Alexander smiled a real, warm smile, full of hope, and nodded. "Yes," he said. "We did." Around them, the chaos of post-performance continued, but Isabella and Alexander existed in their own bubble of gratitude and mutual transformation. They had learned that sometimes the most unexpected acts of kindness can transform multiple lives, that sometimes you have to risk everything to find out who you really are. Isabella had reclaimed her dreams, and Alexander had learned to hope and feel again. Together, they had discovered that it is never too late for a second chance, never too late for beauty to bloom again. In the warmth of the stage lights and the magic of the night, they both knew that this was just the beginning of a new story, a story about redemption, about the courage to dream, and about the transformative power of believing in the impossible.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to keep watching.